They don't kill you right away. That might be wasteful. The Drukhari maintain you alive because your worry is what feeds them. Every scream, every memory, every second you consider get away just makes the torture final longer. You prevent being a person. You turn out to be food. And the worst element, you may stay aware via it all. I recollect the instant I ended being human. Not the moment I was taken. Not the instant the void ship tore open like wet parchment and the screaming began. Not even the moment I saw them for the first time. Those elegant nightmares shifting via the corridors with a grace that mocked the whole thing I understood about predators. No, I finished being human later in an area in which time does not pass the manner it must. Where every second stretches into an eternity of sensation and each eternity collapses into a single perfect notice of discomfort. My call is Mir Tolan. I was an engineer aboard the Emperor's Beneficence, a service provider vessel strolling preferred deliver routes via the Coronus Expanse. He had a spouse as soon as before the cancer took her. He had a daughter, Sarah, who might have been 14 general years old after they took me. He stored her voice recorded on an information slate, only a few seconds of her laughing at something I would said, something I cannot remember anymore. He performed it every night time earlier than sleep there in my quarters where the air recyclers hummed their acquainted track and the ship's heartbeat consistent through the bulkheads. That become my life. Normal, unremarkable, the type of existence that fills the Imperium's vastness like sand fills a barren region. Then the alarm screamed and the entirety that made me Marlin commenced its slow dissolution. The attack came throughout third shift. He used to be in engineering base 7 going for walks diagnostics on the starboard plasma conduits while the primary hull breach registered. Not a clean puncture from asteroid debris or micrometeor impact. The sensors confirmed something tearing through bolstered adamantium love it changed into tissue paper. More than one breaches blossoming throughout the deliver's flank and a sample too envisaged to be unintended. The temperature readings spiked and dropped in not possible sequences. The emergency klaxons wailed their warning. However, there has been something incorrect with the sound. Something that made my enamel ache and my vision blur at the rims. I ran for the engineering deck's command station, my boots clanging at the steel grating round me. The other engineers were doing the identical, their faces tight with managed panic. We have been specialists. We drilled for this. Hull breach protocols were muscle memory written into our bodies through 10,000 repetitions. However, nothing prepared us for what got here through the one's breaches. He noticed technician Vera die first. She became sealing a stress door whilst something moved within the corridor beyond, too rapid for my eyes to track. The door exploded inward, now not from pressure, however from something that unmade its molecular bonds, turning solid metallic into a shower of crystalline fragments that hung within the air like frozen rain. Through that beginning got here apparent so impossibly stunning it hurt to look at without delay. Tall and slim, wrapped in armor that regarded to be crafted from solidified darkness and edges sharp enough to cut mild itself. Its face became included by a mask that showed not anything however clean, featureless alabaster, but I may want to sense its gaze like hooks sinking into my chest. Vera screamed, now not a scream of fear, but of something worse. Reputation perhaps, or realization. The determined moved and Vera came aside, not killed, taken apart, piece with the aid of piece in a series so fast it gave the look of she turned into evaporating, her body becoming a cloud of purple mist and spinning fragments that the discern amassed in a few form of crystalline box that seemed in its hand like a magic trick. The field glowed, pulsed, consumed what it held. He should have run, have to. I sealed myself in one of the emergency shelters, prompted the distress beacon. Carried out something. However, I was frozen, looking as more of those figures poured through the breaches. Everyone shifting with that equal horrible grace. They weren't here to kill us. They were harvesting us, choosing and sorting with the precision of farmers at some point of a harvest. A few group members they killed immediately, their bodies left in which they fell. Others they touched with gadgets that made them capture and convulse earlier than going limp, their eyes open however empty. And a few, like me, they in reality checked out, studied, judged worthy of something worse than demise. I felt the needle slide into my neck before I noticed the discern behind me. The universe tilted sideways, my limbs going numb, my vision contracting to a tunnel. The remaining aspect I saw before darkness took me was the engineering bay's fundamental console still showing the ship's vital signs and symptoms as they flatlined one by one. The Emperor's beneficence became loss of life, and I was being taken someplace the Emperor's light could never attain. When I woke, I used to be in hell. No longer the metaphorical hell the preachers communicate about in their sermons. Not the war-touched madness the chaplain warned in opposition to. This was a bodily region, actual and strong, and more horrible than any demon dream as it became crafted by way of fingers and minds, built with purpose, and maintained with care. A hell designed, engineered, perfected over millennia of exercise. It used to be in a cage, no longer steel bars or reinforced glass, but something that seemed like frozen smoke. Walls that rippled once I touched them and dispatched jolts of sensation through my palms that weren't quite ache and were not pretty delight, but something that made me grasp my hand back and press myself into the corner. The cage became small, barely huge enough to face in, and it hung suspended in open air above a vista that made my thoughts revolt towards what my eyes mentioned. A metropolis considerable past comprehension. Towers that stretched right into a sky the color of bruised meat, their surfaces included in spines and blades, and things that were architecture or could have been sculptures of agony given form. Breathe his arc between the towers, sensitive and impossible, crowded with figures that moved in streams like blood through arteries. The air itself regarded wrong, thick with hues that didn't exist, heavy with scents that bypassed my nose and went directly to the nausea facilities of my brain. Below my cage, a long way underneath, become an arena. It wasn't right away apparent what I used to be seeing. The gap became circular, carved from what gave the impression of black glass that reflected nothing, surrounded via tiers of seating that rose in not possible angles, defying gravity and geometry each. The seats had been filled, hundreds of them, perhaps tens of hundreds, occupied through figures just like the ones who'd taken me, tall and fashionable and fully alien despite their humanoid form. They watched the arena ground with an depth that I should feel even from this distance. Their attention centered like daylight through a lens. At the arena floor, something became happening to a man. He could not look away, failed to need to look, but my eyes have been locked on the scene, as though the cage itself changed into forcing me to witness. The person was bare, his body included in cuts that wept blood too slowly, as if gravity failed to quite work well down there. Around him rotated threes of the stylish nightmares, each keeping instruments that gleamed in the atypical light. They were not torturing him. No, not precisely. They had been performing. Every reduce became precise, planned, located to maximize something I failed to apprehend. The man's screams had a rhythm to them, growing and falling in styles that the gang responded to with their own sounds. No longer cheering, something else, something that sounded like hunger being fed. The performance lasted for what felt like hours. While it ultimately ended, when the man's frame was carried away with the aid of matters that were not quite human anymore, their limbs too long and their moves too fluid, I noticed the group sat. Saw them lean again in their seats like people who'd just completed a satisfying meal. The air above them appeared to shimmer, to thicken, as if something invisible turned into being drawn from the arena ground to the waiting mouths of the spectators. This is after I understood the primary terrible truth approximately this place. They failed to feed on flesh. They consumed the suffering itself. The fear, the ache, the melancholy. Those had been the actual sustenance here, harvested and fed on like plants from a discipline. And I was striking in a cage above that arena, waiting my flip. The cage shifted without warning, transferring via the air as though pulled through invisible threads. Other cages hung nearby. He realized loads of them scattered via the distance above the arena like a grotesque mobile. In every one, a figure huddled or stood or lay curled in on themselves. Human, most of them, although I noticed other shapes, though. Sino species I recognized from planetary defense declares. Matters I didn't understand in any respect. Absolutely everyone harvested from across the galaxy and brought here to this metropolis that existed in a pocket of space where reality bent to accommodate nightmares. My cage drifted in the direction of every other. Inner was a woman, her naval uniform torn and stained. She checked out me with eyes that had visible too much, had long passed somewhere beyond worry right into a territory I didn't have words for. Her lips moved, forming phrases I couldn't hear via the barrier between our prisons. Then her cage descended down in the direction of the arena floor in which fresh units have been being prepared, in which the stylish nightmares waited with the endurance of creatures who had all of eternity to perfect their craft. He watched her face as she found out what changed into going on. Watched the closing remnants of desire drain away, changed by using something worse than depression. Popularity. The understanding that this was real, that it turned into going on, that no rescue would come due to the fact wherever we had been, the Imperium could not reach. She become long gone for 6 hours. I realized because I counted each 2D, using the rhythm of my personal heartbeat as a clock, clinging to that small piece of habitual as if it is able to anchor me to sanity. While her cage rose again, she turned into nevertheless alive, nevertheless respiration, included in marks that fashioned styles throughout her skin, symbols I failed to recognize, however that made my eyes water after I tried to consciousness on them. She failed to take a look at me as her cage drifted beyond. Did not observe whatever. Her eyes have been open, however empty. The whole thing that made her someone scooped out and consumed, leaving best the beef at the back of to keep producing the suffering they crave. I pressed myself into the nook of my cage and thought of Sir's chuckle. Tried to take into account how it sounded, the exact pitch and rhythm. But the memory became slippery, tougher to comprehend than it ought to have been. The cage seemed to pulse round me, heat and nearly comforting, and that rawness made me need to claw at my very own pores and skin. Dime became meaningless. The arena by no means stopped. Overall performance after performance, each one a variation on the subject matter of suffering rendered into artwork. He saw a person kept alive even as his bones had been slowly removed separately, his body collapsing inward like a deflating balloon. He saw a girl forced to watch as her recollections have been extracted and projected onto the area partitions. Her entire existence played out in reverse whilst commentators in the crowd mentioned the flavor of every moment, scored her joys and sorrows like wine tasters evaluating vintages. He noticed things achieved to our bodies and minds that I lacked the words to explain, horrors so specific and refined that they might best have been evolved over centuries of exercise. And between every overall performance, the gang fed, drew in that invisible sustenance, their bodies seeming to bolster and sharpen at the same time as the sufferers wither. These become how they survive. He found out how they endured on this city of eternal twilight. They were parasites feeding on struggling, and we were the farm animals bred to offer it. My cage descended on what could have been the 0.33 day, or the pre-30th. Dime had misplaced all that means. The cycles of the area becoming my most effective clock. He felt the descent beginning, that sickening drop in my belly, and everything in me wanted to scream, to thrash, to do something. However, I'd watched enough performances with the aid of them to recognize that resistance handiest made it higher for them. That worry and battle have been seasonings that enhanced the meal. So, I went nonetheless, targeted on Sarah's snigger, on that scrap of reminiscence that was mine and mine by myself. If I used to be going to be fed on, I would preserve directly to that single piece of myself until the very cease. The cage opened on the arena floor, the smoke partitions dissolving like mist. He stood on black glass that meditated not anything, surrounded by means of growing tiers of hungry faces. The air changed into one of a kind here, thick and cloying, tasting of copper and something sweeter that made my stomach flip. Junits waited on tables carved from a fabric that gave the impression of fossilized screams. Round me, figures circled, studying me the manner a painter studies a blank canvas. One in every of them approached. Lady, a notion, although gender appeared nearly arbitrary with those creatures. She wore armor that seemed adored was crafted from fade skin lacquered to a mirror shine. And her face changed into her personal. Now not masked like the raiders who'd taken me. Stunning in a manner that made me want to appearance away. Capabilities too perfect, too symmetrical, as if someone had taken the concept of splendor and refined it past the factor wherein human minds should system it effortlessly. She spoke and her voice bypassed my ears, performing immediately in my mind with a readability that made my very own mind appear muddy through assessment. You're wondering why of all of the farm animals aboard that vessel you were selected for renovation instead of instantaneous intake. The answer is easy, little engineer. You possess something rare, a middle of resilience wrapped around an unmarried treasured reminiscence. We ought to taste it from the instant our raiders marked you. That desperate clinging to a useless child's laughter. Such great devotion. Such best fuel for what we will make of you. I desired to tell her she become incorrect, that Sarah wasn't useless, that she become nevertheless out there somewhere looking forward to me to come domestic. But the lie would not shape because I knew, had constantly known, even supposing I'd never admitted it, that by the point any rescue found the beneficence's wreckage, Sarah would be grown, might have grieved and moved on, would have built a life that did not include a father who'd vanished into the void. The only vicinity I still existed as her father turned into in that memory in those few seconds of recorded laughter. And now even that was compromised, regarded to the monsters who surrounded me. The beautiful one smiled, and her smile held not anything human. We cannot take it from you. Not but. That could be wasteful. Instead, we are able to educate you to weaponize it yourself. On every occasion you believe you studied of her giggle, you may sense it twist in your chest like a blade. Every moment of affection you consider turns into a fresh source of pain. And you will try this to yourself time and again due to the fact that reminiscence is all you have got left of who you have been. You destroy yourself from within and we can take pleasure in every second of the fall. Apart. She gestured and the performance started. They did not contact me that first session. Did not need to. The beautiful one, who I later learned turned into cold elixir, in a tongue that tasted like poison to talk, truly talked, defined in best detail what they might do to me over the approaching months or years or decades. How they would map every nerve in my body, catalog every fear in my thoughts, isolate every source of potential struggling, and domesticate it like a garden. She explained how pain became crude, how the clearly refined artists of Commorragh worked with subtler materials. Anticipation, dread, desire offered, after which snatched away. The slow cognizance that rescue could never come. That the Imperium I might serve my whole lifestyles did not even know I used to be long past, that my struggling became invisible and meaningless, except as enjoyment for creatures who'd perfected cruelty into an art form over these many years. She informed me about the alternative prisoners I might visible, how the lady from the naval vessel had been a captain as soon as, proud and sturdy, and the way they'd spent weeks breaking down her command instincts, making her betray imaginary team participants in eventualities designed to maximize her guilt. How a man from a hive global had been pressured to relive his adolescence traumas, each reminiscence extracted and amplified till the past was greater real than the present. How another prisoner, one I hadn't visible but, changed into being saved in a country of perpetual nearly rescue. Shown fake Imperial forces arriving to store him best to have them discovered as illusions at the final viable 2D. And she or he told me what that they had deliberate for me. How they could use Sarah's chuckle. How they might make me pay attention it whilst they labored, associating my daughter's voice with ache till the reminiscence itself became torture. How they might ultimately provide me a preference. Heave up the memory, let them take it and cease the affiliation, or keep it and suffer on every occasion I tried to keep directly to who I'd been. The worst component become that I believed her. Each word, due to the fact I could see it in the crowd's faces, the way they leaned forward of their seats, the way their eyes shone with anticipation. These become what they lived for. Now not the crude splatter of blood and screams, but the correct utility of mental pressure, the careful cultivation of depression. When they in the end lowered back me to my cage, I was unmarked, not a scratch on my body. But something interior me had shifted, had all started to crack like glass below pressure. I tried no longer to think about Sir, tried to awareness on something else, on the technical specs of plasma conduits or the liturgies of the Mechanicus or the 1,000 different pieces of information I might accumulated over an entire life of service. However the thoughts doesn't paintings that manner. Inform yourself now not to consider something and it turns into all you may reflect on consideration on. And whenever her giggle surfaced in my memory, I felt Alexra's phrases wrapping around it, poisoning it, turning something valuable right into a source of ache. They were right. I was destroying myself from inside, and that I could not stop. The performances endured around me, and countless parade of struggling subtle into spectacle. I watched a man age a long time in hours, his youth trained away while he screamed on the lack of time he'd by no means get lower back. He watched a lady compelled to choose which of her fellow prisoners would die time and again till the choosing broke something fundamental in her psyche. I watched matters I still can't call completed to bodies and souls. Horrors so particular they may best have been designed for the person sufferer. And among performances my cage could descend, now not constantly to the arena ground. From time to smaller chambers in which Elixir waited along with her units and her questions. She by no means tortured me without delay. As a substitute, she make task approximately my life, approximately Sierra, approximately my wife, approximately the quiet moments of happiness I might skilled in my unremarkable lifestyles. And as I responded, she might take notes, mapping out my emotional panorama with the precision of a crafter charting a new world. On occasion she might show me recordings, footage from the Beneficence's final moments, scenes I hadn't witnessed at some point of the attack. I watched my pals die, saw Technician Vera's very last moments from more than one angles, every view greater particular than the last. I watched the Deliver's captain make a desperate remaining stand, firing his final pistol at raiders who danced across the beams like they had been dancing through rain. He watched the scientific base bloodbath, noticed the wounded completed with casual efficiency. However, I never saw what occurred to the survivors. By no means noticed if anyone else was taken, if all and sundry escaped within the lath pods, if the misery beacon reached Imperial airs. Elixir kept that information from me intentionally, letting me believe every opportunity, letting hope and despair salary struggle in my chest. She might smile at the same time as I watched, reading my face with the intensity of a scholar reading an historic text. Your kind clings so desperately to hope, she said in the course of one consultation. Even if all prove factors to abandonment, you consider rescue. The Emperor looking over you. The Imperium's big machinery grinding slowly closer to salvation. It smiles almost beautiful, this myth. We are able to allow you to maintain it for now. Ope makes the eventual revelation a lot sweeter. He asked her as soon as in a second of desperate braveness, why they did this, why they had to feed on suffering when there had been other approaches to live to tell the tale. The query regarded to clearly hobby her. She paused in her note-taking, thinking about, due to the fact we will, she said in reality. Because we have settled the art of ache to such heights that your crude Imperium cannot even conceive of what we accomplish. You worship a corpse god and call it devotion. We worship nothing but our very own perfection, our very own appetite. We are what your species could be in case you had the courage to embody your nature. Predators, parasites, survivors who refuse to express regret for survival. She leaned nearer, her ideal face filling my imaginative and prescient, and as it feels exact. The feeding, the sustenance we draw from your suffering. It smiles pleasure past anything your confined flesh can revel in ecstasy delicate to an edge so sharp it cuts via the universe itself. Why might we ever stop? He had no solution. What argument may want to I make in opposition to a philosophy perfected over millennia to creatures who'd constructed a whole civilization on the muse of struggling? I was a single man, an engineer who'd lived a quiet existence, trying to attraction to the morality of nightmares. So, I finished trying, stopped searching out motive or mercy or any human reaction. And as a substitute, I started to look at, to observe the arena and the performances the way I might as soon as studied plasma conduit specifications, seeking out patterns, weaknesses, something that might assist me recognize this vicinity in which I used to be trapped. He found out that the area operated on schedules. Sure, varieties of performances have been more famous at certain instances, following rhythms I did not absolutely recognize, but ought to begin to or expecting. I found out that the crowds varied, that some spectators favored mental torture, whilst others favored physical extremes. He discovered that the prisoners who lasted longest had been those who provided novel struggling, precise flavors of depression that hadn't been tasted earlier then. And I learned approximately the metropolis beyond the area, Commorragh. At least I referred to as it the darkish town. An area that existed inside the webway, a historic community of tunnels among realities. Here, the Drukhari, as they known as themselves, had built a civilization powered absolutely by stolen souls and cultivated struggling. Hundreds of thousands of them, perhaps billions, residing in towering spires and deep pits, all fed by means of the consistent inflow of egg harvested from throughout the galaxy. The prisoners within the cages around me have been simply one supply. There had been complete districts devoted to exceptional flavors of suffering. Slab markets where lives were bought and sold, valued no longer by way of hard work but with the aid of the exceptional of worry they could generate. Fleshcrafting laboratories in which bodies had been reshaped into residing artwork pieces. Their pain stretched across years or a long time. Arenas like this one scattered during the town. Every specializing in distinctive types of overall performance. And under it all, the steady hunger, the want to feed, to consume struggling, in any other case face a withering that turned into worse than loss of life. The Drukhari were cursed, elixir defined with something nearly like pride. Their souls were slowly being tired by way of something they referred to as she who thirsts. A goddess issue born from their ancestors' excesses. Best by means of feeding on others' pain could they stave off that hunger, maintain their souls from being absolutely consumed. They have been parasites devouring the galaxy to avoid being devoured themselves. And I used to be just one small meal in an infinite banquet. My second descent to the area ground got here without warning. 1 second I used to be looking every other overall performance, trying to catalog its structure, and the next my cage was dropping, that familiar ill lurch in my stomach. But this time, I wasn't by myself. 3 other cages descended with mine, their occupants visible through the smoke partitions. A person I did not recognize, his frame already covered in scars. I seen his creature with too many limbs. And the woman whose face I would seen earlier then, in every other cage, although she looked special now, hollowed out, used, we were deposited on the arena ground together, our cages dissolving concurrently. The black glass below our FT pondered nothing, but I may want to sense the crowd's attention pressing down like bodily weight. Alexa stood at the arena's aspect, not by myself. Alone with her had been 2 different Drukhari, each male, each sporting contraptions that gleamed with functions I failed to need to understand. The performance that observed wasn't designed for me. He used to be just a witness, forced to watch as the 3 other prisoners were taken aside piece by using piece. No longer killed, by no means killed. The Drukhari were too skilled for that. As an alternative, they were unmade, their bodies open and reorganized in configurations that should not have been survivable, but were kept alive via technologies and techniques I couldn't understand. The man screamed till his voice broke, then said screaming in a whisper that come what may carried through the complete area. The Xenos creature's a couple of limbs have been eliminated and reattached in distinct preparations, turning it right into a dwelling puzzle that writhed in confusion and pain. And the woman, the hollowed out one, was definitely made to observe, to see what became being finished in perfect detail, at the same time as the Drukhari whispered to her approximately how this will be her destiny next time. How she turned into simply moments far from experiencing this herself. He stood within the center of it all, untouched, pressured to endure witness. And I understood that this became my performance. These became what Elixir had designed for me. Not pain, however helplessness. The incapability to forestall or assist or maybe appearance away because turning away could best cause them to force my eyes open could best add resistance to the taste of my struggling. So I watched, cut aloud, attempted to show myself right into a machine that processed facts without feeling it. But I wasn't a system. He used to be Marek Tolan, father of Sarah. Engineer of the Emperor's beneficence. And each scream, every plea, each moment of that performance carved itself into my memory like acid etching glass. While it ended, whilst the other 3 prisoners were overexcited via the now not quite human servants to be healed and organized for destiny use, I stood alone at the area floor. The group's interest shifted, targeted totally on me, waiting to see what I might do, how I'd react. Elixir approached, her actions fluid and unhurried. "You're mastering," she stated, her voice performing in my mind. "Learning that resistance is unnecessary, that the only desire you've got is the way you go through. Will you rage and scream and provide crude leisure, or will you refine your despair into something stunning? The choice is yours, little engineer, but understand that we can revel in either option." Idea of Sarah's chortle. Heard it in my mind. That shiny sound that had as soon as added me jaw. And I felt it twist. Felt the poisoning that elixir had promised. The memory that had sustained me changed into becoming a weapon became inward. And I didn't know the way to stop it. My cage rose, sporting me lower back to my putting jail above the arena. And there, fresh performances were already starting. The equipment of struggling in no way stopped, by no means paused, never showed mercy. And I used to be part of that machinery now, a cog in a widespread engine designed to generate ache. I pressed my face against the cage's smoke wall and wept. Not from ache or worry, however, from know-how, from the conclusion that there has been no escape from this region, no rescue coming, no hope of go back. They exist right here until I used to be used up. My struggling harvested like grain from a subject. And while I used to be sooner or later empty, they could discard me and take the next prisoner from the subsequent raided deliver. These become my future. Measured now not in days or years, but in performances, in periods with Elixira and her units, in descents to the area floor, inside the sluggish erosion of the whole thing that made me human until most effective the suffering remained. And the worst element, the absolutely insufferable reality changed into that I would continue to exist. They could maintain me alive through all of it. Preserving my frame and thought simply sufficient to preserve producing the pain they crave. Loss of life wasn't an alternative. Loss of life might be mercy. And mercy wasn't something that existed in Commorragh. The days blurred collectively. If days even existed in this area wherein time moved consistent with policies I did not apprehend. He advanced to ordinary. As a lot as routine turned into feasible. While my cage became desk-bound, I would work out, maintaining my frame functional through moves practiced in the restrained space. He would recite the litanies I'd found out in my youth, prayers to the emperor that introduced no comfort, however gave my mind something to consciousness on besides the screaming underneath. And I would consider getaway, no longer due to the fact I thought it possible, but because the wondering itself turned into an act of defiance, a way to remind myself that I used to be nevertheless Marek Tolan, nonetheless able to planning and hoping, even supposing each were futile. I studied the area's shape for the duration of the performances I was compelled to witness. Noted the positions of the guards, those warrior Drukhari who stood watch with guns that crackled with slightly contained power. Observed the styles of the servants who carried prisoners to and from the ground, catalogued the places of the gates, the openings that caused corridors past. But every remark handiest bolstered the impossibility. The guards had been too professional, too speedy. Their reflexes greater via technology and centuries of fight experience. The servants, those not pretty human matters, moved in coordinated organizations, never by myself, in no way vulnerable. And the gates led to a city past, a big, sprawling nightmare where a single escaped human could stand out. Like a flame in darkness. Although by hook or by crook reached the Wawe tunnels past Commorragh, even if I navigated the not possible geometries and observed a portal back to real space, I had no ship, no approach of travel, no way to continue to exist in the void. Breakout wasn't a plan. It became a fable, a story I informed myself to avoid, accepting the truth. Yet I saved making plans, kept watching, because the alternative was to surrender completely, to permit myself grow to be the whole puppet I might visible in that woman's eyes. And some stubborn a part of me, the component that had kept working while the beneficence's structures failed, the component that had raised Sierra alone after her mother died, refused to simply accept total defeat. At least I observed, abroad, throughout one among our sessions in her personal chamber, a room embellished with instruments that could have been surgical gear or could have been sculpture, depending on the way you looked at them. She smiled at me with proper amusement. Nonetheless planning your escape. How pleasant. Maximum prisoners abandon wish in the first few performances, however you hold to it like a drowning at a driftwood. Do you realize what that tells me, little engineer, that you have not yet grasped the essential truth of your situation? She gestured, and pics appeared within the air around me. Holograms or hallucinations, I could not tell which. They showed prisoners attempting breakout. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, each strive documented in best element. He watched humans run through corridors simplest to be hunted down for recreation. Noticed the Xenos creature make it to a Wawe portal before being dragged return. Its body broken but stored alive, Witnessed elaborate schemes undone with the aid of betrayal or awful luck or easy miscalculation. Each unmarried try ended the equal way. Recapture, go back to the arenas or the laboratories or the flesh pits and punishment that made the original suffering seem mild with the aid of evaluation. We permit the getaway tries, Alexa defined. They're a part of the performance. The seed kindled and then crushed generates a flavor of despair that simple captivity cannot enshape. So please preserve your planning. Look at our defenses. Dream of freedom. And whilst you subsequently attempt your getaway, we are able to be waiting to transform that desire into the most high-quality pain you've got but experienced. She leaned closer, her ideal face inches from mine. The reality you should accept is this. You are already useless. The moment our raiders decided on you, your existence ended. The entirety that takes place now could be just your corpse getting to know the bounce. The earlier you receive this, the sooner you may start to appreciate the artistry of what we create here. He spat in her face. A crude gesture, childish and useless, but it changed into all I had, all I ought to do to claim that I was still human, nonetheless able to defiance, although that defiance accomplished nothing. She wiped the spit away with one stylish finger, then tasted it, her expression considerate. Interesting, she said. Nonetheless some heart left. Top. We's a purpose to make the breaking more fulfilling. That consultation ended with her asking me to describe Sarah, now not in well-known phrases, however in particular element. The exact coloration of her hair, the pattern of freckles across her nose, the manner her giggle started out quiet after which grew louder because it endured. And as I described my daughter seeking to preserve directly to the memory even as it poisoned me, Alexira took notes, building a detailed photo that I knew she could use towards me. When I returned to my cage, I discovered the alternative prisoners watching me. We could not speak to every different via the smoke walls, however we ought to see. And in their eyes, I diagnosed the same progression I was experiencing. The preliminary terror giving manner to numb popularity, the determined making plans giving manner to whole ordinary, the sluggish dying of the individual they had been, changed via something that existed most effective to go through. One prisoner, an older man whose cage hung close sufficient that I ought to see his face truly, mouthed words at me. I couldn't pay attention them, but I should read his lips. Simply the identical word time and again. Allow cross. Allow go. Let pass. He wasn't telling me to escape. He turned into telling me to give up, to stop combating, to simply accept the reality of this area. Dola Marak Tolandai in order that what remained may want to exist without the burden of desire. I grew to become far from him, confronted the area rather, looking as clean prisoners were brought down for the crowd's leisure. And I made a decision that was in all likelihood insane, likely suicidal, but turned into the handiest element I had left. He wouldn't let go, would not surrender, even though wish changed into a weapon used in opposition to me. Even if planning my breakout most effective made my struggling worse, although every second of defiance was precisely what Elixir wanted, I might continue to be Marek Talon, father and engineer for as long as I possibly should. Not due to the fact it might save me, but because the opportunity was to end up a component, a device, an instrument in their palms. If I used to be going to be fed on, I might at least cause them to work for it. The next performance I was a part of involved fire. Now not crude flames, however something the Drukhari had refined. A burning that consumed nerve endings without destroying tissue that could be sustained for hours or days without killing. He used to be suspended in a body along 4 different prisoners. Our bodies placed to create a dwelling sculpture. And then the burning commenced. He had thought I understood ache. Had skilled damaged bones, burns from plasma coolant leaks, the 1,000 minor injuries of an engineer's existence. However this was unique. This became ache as an art shape, carefully modulated to avoid unconsciousness, designed to preserve the thoughts sharp and conscious even as the body screamed for launch. And via it all, I heard Sarah's chuckle. Alexa had integrated the sound into the overall performance come what may, gambling it in subtle variations, blending it with the crackle of the flames and the screams of the other prisoners. My daughter's voice, that brilliant sound of joy, became the soundtrack to my agony. He felt something destroy inside me at some stage in that overall performance. Not my body, which the Drukhari saved carefully intact, but something deeper. A few core of resistance that had sustained me through the preceding classes. After they finally ended the burning, when they again met in my cage, I was changed, hollowed out in a way I would seen within the other prisoners, however hadn't understood till I felt it myself. The cage felt almost comforting now. The smoke partitions warm and defensive. After the intensity of the area, the easy lifestyles of hanging in area felt like relief. And that I recognized the lore in that feeling. They had been schooling me to be thankful for the cage, to see it as sanctuary instead of prison, to decide upon the isolation to the fear of the performances. He was being domesticated, changed into something that could perform on command, that might generate suffering with increasing performance that would in the end help them ruin new prisoners simply to keep away from being damaged myself. And I didn't realize a way to stop it. Dime continued its meaningless passage. He counted performances to mark the times, reached arbitrary numbers, and then forgot them. 100 500 8000 descends to the arena floor. Me variations on the subject of suffering. A few performances had been short, lasting most effective minutes. Others stretched for what felt like weeks, elaborate productions that concerned dozens of prisoners and spectators from across Commorragh. I started out to recognize faces inside the crowd. Ordinary attendees who got here for particular types of overall performance. An ancient Drukhari woman who best watched mental torture. Her face wrapped all through periods wherein prisoners were made to betray imaginary loved ones. A male who specialized in gathering screams, recording them in crystalline devices, and later playing them back in diverse combinations like a musician composing symphonies. A set who wagered on how long prisoners could maintain sanity, putting bets on an appropriate second while minds would shatter. They became acquainted, merely relaxed in their consistency, and that I hated myself for locating comfort in the workouts of my very own torture. Alisa's periods grew extra intricate. She began bringing in gadgets that affected reminiscence without delay, extracting unique moments from my past and replaying them with alterations. He relived my wife's loss of life a dozen unique approaches, every version greater painful than the truth. He watched Sarah develop up in fast forward. Noticed her laugh without me. Noticed her forget my face and move on. He skilled futures that in no way had been. Timelines wherein the beneficence changed into by no means rated, and I grew old in quiet career. And each reminiscence, genuine or false, changed into poison by using the context, by way of the knowledge that I used to be experiencing it in a Drukhari torture chamber, that each emotion I felt changed into being harvested and ate up, that even my tears were entertainment for creatures who'd perfected cruelty into an enterprise. She showed me other prisoners being broken completely, made me watch as they misplaced themselves as personalities dissolved, and simplest the struggling remained. He saw a person who'd been a standard as soon as, commanding heaps, reduced to a thing that might handiest whimper and obey. I saw a lady who'd been assigned on her international, worshipped with the aid of tens of millions, now satisfied that she deserved each second of pain because the emperor had abandoned her for her sins. And that I saw what took place to prisoners who survived too long, who supplied suffering for years or many years till their ability for fresh pain become exhausted. They weren't killed. Loss of life could be wasteful. As a substitute, they were converted. They are bodies reshaped by way of the flesh crafters into new bureaucracy. Residing fixtures, ornamental pieces, servants whose minds had been simply aware enough to understand what they'd turn out to be, but unable to withstand or get away. That turned into the proper horror of Commorragh. No longer the pain, which was terrible, but finite. However, the eternity, the expertise that you might in no way stop present, by no means be granted the discharge of dying, would as a substitute be recycled and repurposed until the warmth death of the universe itself. He met another engineer in the course of one overall performance. We had been located in adjoining frames, our bodies positioned, so we confronted each different for the duration of a session that worried slowly increasing strain on specific nerve clusters. Among screams for the duration of the quick respites that the Drukhari allowed to save you unconsciousness, he managed to whisper. "How long have you ever been right here?" He did not recognize. Instructed him so. Does not count. A stated time would not work right. Ibe been here 3 years or 30 or 3 days. Cannot tell anymore. But I consider you from before. You had been on the beneficence, right? The name of my deliver spoken by means of another survivor. It hit me harder than any physical torture. Evidence that my past had been real, that Mari Cullen had existed someplace other than in my poisoned recollections. You escaped? He asked. The existence pods, he laughed. A valid that become greater like sobbing. Nobody escaped. They got everybody. Each unmarried man or woman aboard. A few they killed, some they took. The ones they took are scattered across the town. In arenas, in flesh pits, in private collections. I have seen them every so often. Technician Vera continues to be alive. Did you realize that, they have been using her for years? She does not don't forget her call anymore. The stress accelerated, slicing off further communication. But his phrases stayed with me. No one escaped, everybody taken. The beneficence absolutely harvested. Every lifestyles aboard both snuffed out or transformed into struggling gas for the Drukhari's limitless hunger. And the Imperium, had they even observed? Did they realize the ship changed into lacking? Or had it truly been marked as lost in the warp, every other statistic in the widespread ledger of human demise that crammed the galaxy, became all and sundry searching out us? Or had we already been forgotten? A notion about the administrator's bureaucracy, the giant system that tracked trillions of lives throughout tens of millions of worlds. One merchant vessel misplaced inside the expanse would not even sign up as enormous. Our deaths, our suffering, our entire consumption become invisible to the Imperium we would serve. We were alone, absolutely and completely, and the weight of that information turned into heavier than any physical torture. The performance ended. The engineer turned into overexcited by using the servants. He never noticed him once more. Do not know if he is nonetheless acting someplace in Commorragh or if he finally reached the factor wherein his suffering was exhausted and he was converted into something else. But his phrases stayed with me. All of us taken, nobody escaped. And slowly, so slowly I failed to note it taking place until it become executed. He felt the last remnants of hope die. Now not with a tree's dramatic cognizance. Now not with tears or screams or desperate denial. It absolutely dwindled away like a candle burning down to nothing. Until one day I looked for it and found most effective emptiness where hope had been. He was in my cage while it came about, watching any other performance under, cataloging its shape out of dependency rather than purpose. And I realized I was now not planning breakout, no longer imagining rescue, no longer thinking of myself as Merrick Tolan, engineer and father, briefly imprisoned, but fundamentally unchanged. He was a prisoner. That became my identity now, my purpose, my entire existence. Whatever I would been before became irrelevant. A tale told about someone else, disconnected from the fact of what I would turn out to be. Alisa observed the exchange for the duration of our subsequent consultation. She smiled with real warmth, the primary real emotion I would visible her express. There it smiles, she said softly. Acceptance, you have in the end understood. And now, little prisoner, now we are able to begin the real work. Now that you've stopped combating what you're, we can refine your struggling into something simply lovely. She become right. So anything in me had basically modified. The element that had resisted, that had clung to identification and hope and defiance, were worn away like stone underwater. What remained changed into adaptable, trainable, geared up to be shaped into something they needed. And the worst element turned into the comfort I felt. Agitation that the warfare became over, that I no longer needed to hold the hard fiction of being someone I wasn't. That I should without a doubt exist inside the role that they had assigned me. Carry out when called upon, go through while required, and relaxation in my cage among periods. He had become precisely what Elixir had promised. My corpse learning to dance. The performances modified after that, became greater problematic, more tailored to my unique psychology. Elixir had spent months mapping my mind, understanding my fears and desires, and the precise shapes of my trauma. Now, she used that know-how to create periods designed in particular for me, performances that no one else ought to have skilled the identical way. She brought in actors who pretended to be Sarah. Drukhari, who'd studied the recordings from my information slate and could mimic my daughter's voice, her mannerisms, her chortle. They would plead with me to shop them, to shield them. Even as I stood paralyzed in restraints, pressured to look at as they had been taken apart. She created scenarios where I was given alternatives. Estor one prisoner or any other. Endure it myself or watch it inflicted on others. Cooperate with the torture or withstand and make it worse for everybody. Each preference designed to generate guilt to make me complicit within the struggling to show me into my personal torturer. She incorporated my recollections of the beneficence into the performances. Made me relive the attack however from extraordinary perspectives. Confirmed me what occurred within the sections I hadn't visible. Made me watch technician Vera's transformation from able professional to damaged aspect and suggested that my moves for the duration of the assault had one way or the other contributed to her destiny. And through it all, she fed. They all fed. The group, the performers, even the servants regarded to attract something from the suffering being generated. I ought to see them growing stronger, sharper, more vibrant while I dwindled. A transaction so ideal it became almost stunning. Magic converted immediately into their sustenance. Not anything wasted. Every scream and tear and second of depression harvested with most performance. I understood finally why that they had refined torture into an artwork shape. It wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It turned into survival. They wished struggling the way people wished food and water. And I used to be cattle cautiously maintained to provide the maximum yield. That information delivered a peculiar type of peace. I wasn't being singled out for a few cosmic punishment. Wasn't procuring sins or being examined through the emperor. He was definitely stuck in a meal's chain, a predator-prey dating that existed beyond morality or which means. The Drukhari fed on me due to the fact they could, due to the fact I used to be the behead, due to the fact my species become susceptible sufficient to be harvested, and my character lifestyles turned into insignificant enough to be expended. There has been no grand cause to my suffering, no lesson to analyze, no redemption to earn, simply an countless cycle of consumption, and I used to be on the incorrect give up of it. Cycles handed, innumerable performances, uncountable periods with Elixir and her contraptions. The bounds of my identity endured to erode. I ended considering myself as Marek. Stopped seeking to don't forget my beyond. While Alex Array asked questions about my lifestyles, I replied automatically the phrase is empty of that means or emotion. The most effective issue I held onto, the most effective scrap of my former self that remained, becomes Sarah's snicker. That reminiscence, poisoned and twisted even though it turned into, stayed sharp and clean at the same time as the whole lot else blurred. I'd play it in my mind at some stage in performances, using the sound as an anchor factor, something to focus on besides the pain. Alexa knew, of path, she'd constantly acknowledged. And in the future for the duration of a session in which she become doing something problematic with nerve stimulation and reminiscence extraction, she made her provide. "I can take it from you," she said. "The reminiscence of your daughter's giggle. I can cast off it completely. Erase it out of your mind. Stop the affiliation between her voice and your ache. You would be freed from that precise burden. Free to suffer without that precise torment. All you have to do is ask, beg me, little prisoner. Plead with me to dispose of the final piece of who you have been. Heave up that final scrap of identity, and I will grant you this mercy." I understood the entice, understood that this become the end result of the whole lot she'd been building towards. If I asked her to take the memory, I might be selecting my very own destruction, actively participating within the erasure of Marek Tolan. And that choice, that moment of inclined self-annihilation might generate struggling so refined, so perfect that she would feed on it for years. But I also understood that refusing become just some other form of cooperation. That by way of clinging to the memory no matter the pain it brought on, I was playing precisely the function she designed for me. There has been no proper preference, no alternative that represented true resistance or defiance. Each course brought about the identical destination, my whole consumption. So, I made an exclusive choice. One which amazed each of us. He laughed. No longer Sir's laugh, but my own. A sound I hadn't made in see you later I might forgotten how. It commenced quiet, only a snigger, however it grew. Abby become louder, we there, touched with actual hysteria. I laughed at the lure, at the selection, on the complicated structure of struggling that Alexra had built round me. He laughed at my very own insignificance, at the absurdity of one human awareness mattering in a galaxy that spanned millions of worlds and trillions of souls. He laughed at the Drukhari and their refined cruelty, at the fact that they wanted us so desperately that for all their electricity and sophistication they had been parasites depending on lesser species for survival. And I laughed at Merrick Tolan, that ordinary engineer who'd notion his quiet life supposed something, who'd believe that love and responsibility and career mattered whilst measured towards the sizable indifference of the universe. Alisa watched me laugh with an expression I could not study. Not anger or pride or maybe interest, something else, something that would have been recognition. When I finally stopped, while the laughter died away and left simplest silence, she spoke quietly. You have got long past breaking into something new. Thrilling. Maximum prisoners either shatter or publish, but you have got found a third route. Recognition without give up. Lifestyles without meaning. You got come to be a real resident of Commorragh, little prisoner. You recognize us now. She was proper. He did recognize. Understood that means became something we imposed on an uncaring universe. That struggling and joy have been simply sensations, chemical reactions in meat machines, full size only because we chose to lead them to so. That my daughter's laugh, treasured because it become in the end simply vibrations in air, styles of sound that my brain interpreted as vital. And information that, I discovered I ought to keep the memory without it destroying me. Could place Sarah's snigger in my thoughts and feel the pain of its poisoning and virtually examine both as phenomena happening in my cognizance without judgment or attachment. I had end up whole, empty, a field for suffering without a self to go through. And in that hollowness, I discovered an abnormal type of freedom. Not breakout, in no way breakout, however the freedom that comes from having not anything left to lose. From present without desire or fear or expectation, from being a witness to my very own destruction in preference to a player. Alisa modified her method after that. The performances became less complicated, more fundamental, natural sensation without psychological framework. Ache implemented for its own sake in preference to wrapped in that means. She changed into checking out me, I found out, seeing if my new nation might be broken, if there was a few stage of physical suffering that could shatter the detachment I would finished. But I remained hollow, present, but absent. Struggling without experiencing the suffering as mine. My body could scream and thrash and beg, but I would watch from somewhere remote, noting the responses without claiming ownership of them. I don't know if this pissed off her or glad her. Don't know if she noticed it as failure or success, however the performances persisted and that I endured to offer suffering and the equipment of Commorragh kept turning. Someplace in that length, I observed that the opposite prisoners had been looking me in another way. The ones in nearby cages who I might seen acting, who I'd witnessed break and hole out, they looked at me with something that would have been recognition or caution or desire, even though hope seemed like a phrase that did not observe anymore. Considered one of them, during a collection overall performance wherein several of us were placed together, controlled to whisper to me among the established torture. You found it, he stated. The region passed. I have been there. It would not remaining. They may pull you lower back. They constantly do. I desire to ask how. Desire to recognize what may want to probably drag me out of the emptiness I'd performed. But the performance continued and the moment exceeded and I forgot the question in the routines of suffering. But he turned into right. The hollowest didn't ultimate. It ended at some point of a consultation where Alex Red did something new. So many things she'd seemingly been making ready for months, constructing toward through all the preceding performances. She introduced in a device I hadn't visible before. A crystalline construct that hummed with energies I didn't recognize. This, she defined, is a soul trap. A technology we use to seize cognizance to tug a soul from its flesh prison and preserve it in crystalline stasis. We generally use it on the dying, keeping their very last moments of terror for later consumption, however it has different packages. She activated the tool and that I felt something pulling at my attention. Not my body, but whatever occupied my body. The attention that thought of itself as me, whole and indifferent, although it had become. I felt it being drawn in the direction of the crystal, felt my perspective shifting, reality bending. After which I was inside the crystal, searching out. My frame stood wherein I would left it, but I was now not occupying it. He used to be trapped within the soul trap, a cognizance without form, capable of perceive however no longer have interaction. And as I watched, Alexira delivered in something else. A child, Jangir, perhaps 8 or 9 widespread years, human, girl, terrified. She would not have a call anymore, Elixir stated, her voice attaining me in some way through the crystal's prison. She become taken from a raid on a frontier world, however we've got been education her, teaching her to mimic, to act, to become anything we want. And what we need now's for her to end up your daughter. The child looked at my empty body with huge eyes. And then, in a voice I'd have diagnosed throughout the galaxy, across any distance, she laughed. Sierra's snort, ideal in every element, every nuance, now not a recording, no longer an imitation, however the identical snigger come what may extracted from my reminiscences and implanted in this infant's throat. He felt the hollowest shatter. Felt the whole thing. I would carefully dissociate it from come dashing lower back in a wave of emotion so powerful it might have pushed me to my knees if I would have knees. Rage and grief and horror and something worse than all of those. Recognition that I had allowed this to take place, that by way of current, by persevering with to preserve that memory, I had furnished the template they needed to create this abomination. The kid spoke in Sarah's voice, calling me daddy, asking me why I might left her, begging me to return domestic. And that I screamed, a soundless scream that echoed through the crystal prison, even as Alexra fed on the struggling of a soul torn from its defensive numbness and pressured back into feeling. Whilst she subsequently lowered back me to my body, while the soul trap released me and I crashed back into my flesh, I used to be not hollow. He was uncooked, uncovered. The whole lot I would cautiously buried got here flooding lower back. And with it got here the information that there was no breakout from feeling, no detachment ideal sufficient to shield me. They might constantly find a manner to make me suffer, to drag me lower back from something shelter I would manage to construct. That became when I honestly broke. Not into portions, however into popularity. Real acceptance. Now not the philosophical detachment I might completed earlier then. The expertise that this turned into my life now and for all time. That they go. Drove and they would feed and the cycle might maintain till my capacity for clean pain become exhausted. And that they transformed me into something else. There has been no third route, no smart getaway via intellectual gymnastics or philosophical cognizance. There was simplest suffering extended throughout an eternity that I couldn't measure or recognize. Back to my cage modified once more. The alternative prisoners watched, and that I noticed of their eyes that they had experienced similar revelations, similar moments wherein the closing refuges had been stripped away, and that they had been left with not anything but the reality in their scenario. We were meals, renewable sources, vegetation grown for harvest, and the harvest might never quit. Dime became surely meaningless after that. Not in the philosophical field, however in the sensible one. He finished counting performances, stopped looking to mark the passage of cycles, stopped looking to preserve directly to any sense of earlier than and after. There has been most effective the eternal now of struggling, moments strung together without connection or that means. He achieved when called, suffered while required, rested when authorized, and somewhere in that habitual, Marek-Tolan finished loss of life. What remained became only a issue that generated pain, a function as opposed to someone. Sarah's chortle still performed in my mind now and again, however it not belonged to my daughter. It become only a sound, a cause that the Drukhari used to beautify particular flavors of suffering. He felt no possession of it anymore. No connection to the woman it had come from or the life I'd lived with her. I was a prisoner of the Drukhari. That became my whole identity, my purpose, my lifestyles. And I would continue to be a prisoner until they decided I'd served my reason and transformed me into furnishings or sculpture or some other shape of ornamental suffering. That was the very last truth of Commorragh. The information that broke every prisoner in the end. No longer that we couldn't escape, although that turned into authentic, however that we might already been transformed, already been consumed. The screaming meat that performed within the arenas changed into simply the last remnant of something that had died the instant the raiders decided on us for renovation. We were taking walks, corpses mastering to bounce. And the dance might by no means end. In my cage above the arena, watching fresh prisoners introduced and to start their own descent into information. I now and again wondered if I should experience something. Pity for them, harmony, a few reputation of shared fate, however I felt nothing. They have been simply more resources being processed via the machine, extra fuel for the infinite hunger. And I used to be a part of that system now, had been integrated into its workings so very well that I could not don't forget being something else. Once in a while Elixir might use me in performances with new prisoners, could have me play roles designed to break them faster. The veteran prisoner who'd given up hope. The voice of despair that whispered there has been no rescue coming. I performed those roles automatically, successfully, without emotion or funding, simply appearing some other function in carrier of the extra device. That turned into what it meant to be a prisoner of the Drukhari. Not the torture, even though the torture changed into consistent and sundry and refined past anything the human mind should have conceived on my own. However, the transformation, the slow conversion from individual to factor to characteristic to fuel, the knowledge that you existed simplest to be ate up, that your struggling changed into your simplest reason, that dying could never come to supply lunch. We were stored alive to feed them, prolonged, preserved, maintained like farm animals. And we would maintain current on this nation, not for years or decades, but for hundreds of years doubtlessly. For as long as our capacity to generate sparkling struggling remained. That was the genuine horror. Now not the pain of any man or woman moment, however the infinity of moments. They know how that this turned into lifestyles now, that there has been no lead to sight, that rescue became a myth and desire become a weapon, and which means become something we might lost the moment we had been taken. He existed in my cage above the area, a aspect that had once been Mericlan, looking the performances under, and anticipating my next descent. And I knew with the knowledge that came from complete information that this turned into all I'd ever be, all I may want to ever be. A prisoner of the Drukhari, a supply of suffering, a drop within the extensive ocean of ache that sustained their civilization. Somewhere within the actual universe, on a few planet I might never see once more, a female who'd been my daughter was living her life, growing, changing, shifting ahead. She'd forgotten me by means of now. I'd to have forgotten due to the fact the opportunity became too merciless to contemplate. My lifestyles was invisible to her. My struggling meaningless. My fate unknown. And that became proper. That became the way it should be. Because say what I would come to be wasn't her father anymore. Wasn't they even definitely human? Turned into just a component that generated pain in a city built from suffering. A cog in a gadget that had been walking for 10,000 years and could run for 10,000 more. That turned into the final lesson of Commorragh. The knowledge that got here whilst all other understanding had been stripped away. We had been nothing, had always been nothing, would stay nothing until we had been used up and discarded. And the universe could retain spinning, indifferent to our screams, uncaring about our fate. He had wanted to recognize what had become one to be a prisoner of the Drukhari. Now I knew it changed into like being lifeless even as nonetheless alive. Light current in a state wherein suffering changed into the handiest steady and time become meaningless and hope became a reminiscence of a memory of something you'll as soon as felt. It became like ceasing to be human and becoming a aid as an alternative. Renewable, maintainable, expendable. It become like understanding that survival intended not anything whilst survival became the punishment in place of the praise. That changed into what it become like. That become what I had turned out to be. That was all I would ever be. A prisoner, a supply, a element forever.